W.D. Ross is famous for his 1930 book, The Right and the Good. And we'll be looking at the second chapter of that, which is called What Makes Right Acts Right. Why he is remembered is because he tries to come up with a theory that in some senses splits the difference between the two major contenders of ethical theories, certainly at the time he was writing, early 20th century. And the two major contenders, still to this day, are the deontological theory of Immanuel Kant, which I would say is, well, that one sort of had another jolt of energy in the latter half of the 20th century when a whole bunch of students of John Rawls, influenced by his sort of common sense interpretation of Kant, wrote a lot of things about Kant. Honora O'Neill is the British version. She wasn't a student of Kant, but I know Christine Korsgaard and Barbara Herman are two famous students of Rawls who wrote about Kant's moral theory. So Kant's moral theory is deontological, as I said, which means it says that there are inviolable moral rules. And famously, Kant says you can work out what the moral rules are from the one overarching moral rule, which he calls the categorical imperative, and of which he gives three interpretations which he claimed give the same results, but most commentators ever since have denied that. But the simplest and most straightforward version of it is act so that you could will the maximum of your action to be a universal law. That is, if you're about to do something, say tell a lie to avoid embarrassment or something like that, the way to tell whether or not this is the right action is to imagine if everybody followed that law, would a society in which everybody followed this law, would that be sustainable? Would it make sense? That's the way to test whether or not what you're doing is right. In other words, all moral actions should be universalizable. They should be such that everybody could follow them. It's a very powerful theory, and there's lots of other elements to it. But the key point is that it is a rule-based view, and what's perhaps most important in judging your action is your intentions. Are your intentions the right ones? Are you doing things for the right action, for the right reasons? If you're not doing things for the right reasons, if you're just stumbling into doing the right thing, say by accident, or by, you're motivated by selfishness, but you end up doing the right thing, then your action does not have moral worth. It's only if your intentions are correct that it has moral worth. That's Kant's view. And the major alternative to this is the view of the utilitarians. The most famous utilitarianism has long roots in history. You could argue that the ancient Greek contemporary of Aristotle, Epicurus, was a sort of proto-utilitarian. But the most famous early systematic presentation of the theory is by Jeremy Bentham. And he didn't actually call it utilitarianism. He argued for something he called a hedonic calculus. Essentially, according to him, the only thing that has intrinsic value is pleasure. Intrinsic value means good in itself, not good because of what it brings about. So, for example, money is not an intrinsic value. We value money. We think money is good, but it is not intrinsically valuable. It's only valuable because we can buy things that we want with it. And you could the test for this is, imagine if you're on a deserted island. An intrinsic good is something you would want even in those situations, when the normal things that it could get you are not available. So obviously money would be of no use to you on a deserted island, so that shows that it's not an intrinsic good. But pleasure would be of value to you even on a deserted island. You want pleasure. So Bentham argued that the only intrinsic good was pleasure, the only intrinsic bad was pain, and structured his ethical theory around that. Essentially, the idea that the overarching principle of Bentham-style hedonic utilitarianism is that we have a duty to maximize pleasure for all affected. In the early pages of the Ross reading, Ross says, hedonic utilitarianism is at least better than egoism. Egoism says my one duty is to maximize my own pleasure, or at least hedonic egoism would be. Whereas hedonic utilitarianism says, no, I've got to maximize pleasure for all. And famously, utilitarianism can require great personal sacrifice. In fact, it could easily be my job to sacrifice myself entirely if that maximizes happiness. If, like I'm wedged in the entrance to a cave and it's filling up with water and it'll drown all the people in the cave, and I have the means of blowing myself up to open the cave so that they can escape, I should do that. I should kill myself to save others. So it's not egoistic, and in that respect, Ross says it's better than the alternative. However, it has the major flaw. He would say that it's just clear that pleasure is not the only thing good in itself. There are other things that are good in themselves. And on page 24, he lists the three main types of things that are good in themselves. He doesn't actually have much to say about goods in this chapter. He's much more interested in what's right in this chapter. But he does say, it will be argued in our fifth chapter that there are three main things that are intrinsically good: virtue, knowledge, and with certain limitations, pleasure. So he would say pleasure is probably the least of these. Now, the fourth good is not specifically named on page 27. He calls it a more complex good, which is the proportionment of happiness to virtue. This could be called justice, because it's people getting what they deserve. The proportionalness of happiness to virtue, in other words, are you as happy as you deserve to be or as unhappy as you deserve to be? So the fourth good would be justice, and it's a more complex good than the three basic ones, which are virtue, knowledge, and pleasure. So those things are good in themselves. You can't reduce virtue and knowledge and justice to just being instrumentally valuable insofar as they give pleasure, according to Ross. So this marks him as a value pluralist. The hedonic utilitarian is a value monist. In a sense, Kant is too, because Kant says the one good thing is the good will, which is your will. One way of explaining what your will is it's sort of the thing inside you that makes decisions. And a good will is a will that is oriented so that it makes the right decisions for the right reasons. And Kant says at some point that the value of a will shines forth like a diamond. A good will, its value shines forth like a diamond. So in that sense, it is above price. So he sounds like a value monist too. Whereas at least ideal utilitarianism, I'm not sure if this is the name that G.E. Moore himself gives it, or if this is what commentators have, and in particular Ross, but it's referred to as ideal utilitarianism. Instead of the overarching principle being to maximize pleasure for all affected is to maximize good, where good comes in different flavors. So this makes the decision procedure in ideal utilitarianism a bit more complicated than hedonic utilitarianism, because there are different things. You have to weigh up different goods, and you can't necessarily say that one can be measured out in units of the other. But ideal utilitarianism is still utilitarianism. Kant is a deontologist. Utilitarianism is consequentialist. So where Kant says your action is right insofar as you are motivated in the right way, your right action can be judged according to its intentions, a consequentialist says whether or not your action is right depends on the consequences it brings about. Intentions be damned. So if you maximize good by your action, then your action was the right action. Doesn't matter why you did it. It just matters the consequences. Okay, so these are the two. Some version of utilitarianism and Kant are the key rivals, deontological versus consequentialist. Now, Ross, at the time Ross is writing, in the context he's writing in Britain in the 1930s, utilitarianism is probably the dominant theory. And in general, utilitarianism, I would say, dominates in England and the former Commonwealth countries. For example, utilitarianism very popular in Australia. So he makes that his primary target in the chapter we read. His criticism of Kant, the main criticism of Kant, is that it is too, it's too monistic. First of all, it says that there's only one thing that is of value. And secondly, it doesn't allow the possibility of competing duties. It makes moral decisions sound simpler than they really are. If Kant argues that in any circumstance there will always be just one right act for you to do, and it will be pretty clear what that right act is. Whereas Ross wants to say, no, life is a lot messier than that. You can have genuinely conflicting duties. So Kant seems to assume that it is always possible to both know what is right in a situation and also that there be one right thing. Whereas for Ross, you can be under two duties, both of which are genuine moral duties, but they are pushing in different directions in certain circumstances. And we have to make a decision. Now, utilitarianism would say, hey, that's an advantage of our theory. Our theory enables you to weigh up conflicting, suppose somebody gives you a hideous sweater for Christmas and asks you if you like it. And you have to decide, should I say yes, which is a lie, or should I say no, which is the truth? And you could say, according to utilitarianism, you could say, well, on the one hand, we work out the consequences on the person who's asking's pleasure. Obviously, they'll be sad if the sweater, maybe it's your gran and she knitted it and she put a lot of effort into it, and you'll make her sad. And that is obviously morally important because you cause displeasure in your gran. But on the other hand, if you lie, maybe down the road she'll find out and she'll feel more upset, or maybe other people will know you're lying and the effect will be that they won't trust you in the future, which will, also lower the level of pleasure. But you're weighing pleasure against pleasure. You can always do the math. You can sort of tot it up. Displeasure, there's always a calculation you can do to work out the right balance. Whereas, if you genuinely believe that there are absolute moral duties that can conflict, it seems like this will lead to stagnation, that there isn't a right answer to a moral debate, that we are, in some sense, paralyzed, morally paralyzed. That's the challenge that a pluralistic deontology has to face. Okay, so what is Ross's theory? Ross's theory is that there are 5, as he calls them, prima facie duties. So this notion of a prima facie duty is the thing that he is most famous for. And it's kind of ironic that he immediately, having introduced, I mean, even before he lists the prima facie duties on page 21, they are duties of fidelity, duties of there are duties resting on previous acts of my own that include duties of fidelity and duties of reparation. Some rest on previous acts of other people. These are duties of gratitude. Some rest on the fact or possibility of a distribution of pleasure or happiness. These are duties of justice. Some rest on the mere fact that there are other beings in the world whose condition we can make better. These are duties of beneficence, so you have a duty to do good to others. And some rest on the fact that we can improve our own. So these are duties of self-improvement. So, duties that rely on things that I've done, duties that rely on things that other people have done, duties of justice, that I can affect who gets what according to their desert, duties of beneficence, I can help people, and duties of self-improvement. There's also the duty of non-maleficence. So this numbering system, I'm not sure I've quite got it right, but those are, that would sort of come under duties of beneficence. So, and actually, duties of non-maleficence can be more important. In other words, I have a first do no harm. My first duty is not to harm others, and then I have a duty to help others. Anyway, I'm not really interested in the exact listing. I mean, that's a topic that people can haggle over, but it's not like Ross is saying, this is it, you know, I've uncovered a truth of the universe. There are exactly these number of duties. What he's saying is there are distinct duties, each of which is irreducible to the others. You can't explain a duty of beneficence in terms of a duty of justice. You can't sort of reduce one to another in the same way that Kant and utilitarians say you can reduce everything to whether you're following the categorical imperative or whether you're maximizing pleasure. He's saying these are genuinely distinct, and they can pull in different directions. All right, what does he mean prima facie duties? Well, as he says even before he lists them, this is a bad title, but I just can't think of a better one. So prima facie means, well, the English version is like at first glance or at first blush. In other words, the way things appear initially. And there's an implication there that possibly this is misleading. So you can say that car dealer was prima facie honest. And he says, I don't like that implication. He says it suggests that what we are... actually, yeah, he calls them prima facie duties, and then he criticizes calling them duties and criticizes calling them prima facie. The prima facie, he says, suggests that one is speaking only of an appearance. But whereas what I am speaking of is an objective fact involved in the nature of the situation. So, Ross is a moral realist. A moral realist is somebody who says that there are genuine moral facts. And although this is disputed, it's usually claimed that he follows G.E. Moore in being a non-naturalist. So it's worth writing those down because I forgot to do that. Realist and non-naturalist. Realist means that it's a real fact of the universe that moral claims correspond to a moral reality. Now, as we will see when we look at Mackey, a later Oxford philosopher who famously gives the argument from queerness, he says it's an anti-realist argument. It suggests that if moral facts were real, they would be very strange, and in fact so strange that they can't be real. But certainly Ross is saying it's a truth. In other words, when I say that when I make a moral claim that stealing is wrong or breaking a promise is wrong, that is a claim that has truth value, and what makes it true is some feature of the universe. The universe is not value-free. It comes with values built in. And these values cannot be reduced, says G. Moore famously coined the term the naturalistic fallacy. And the naturalistic fallacy is, according to G. Moore, the claim that moral facts can be reduced to facts about physics or something like that, facts that we're more familiar with. Like, for example, utilitarians are doing, or at least hedonic utilitarians. Hedonic utilitarians say morality can be reduced to facts about pleasure. This commits the naturalistic fallacy, according to G. Moore, because pleasure is a natural property and morality is not. So it is a feature of the universe that is non-natural. It's not what physics can describe or something like that. Now, Ross doesn't go into any lengths committing himself to non-naturalism, but that's how he's usually interpreted. But he's certainly a realist. And he says that there are 4 good things in the universe that that will affect what our duties are. Yes, so prima facie duties is misleading. He thinks that, first of all, he says it's misleading because it uses the word duties, and it suggests that what we are speaking of is a certain kind of duty, when it is in fact not a duty, but something related in a special kind to duty. This gets confusing because later on he talks about actual duties, and it tries to explain the relationship between actual duties, which are what we should do. Our actual duty in any circumstance is what we should do relative to the circumstance we're in. Like, should I tell the truth to Gran about the sweater? My duty in that situation is either to tell the truth, if that is my duty, or to lie, if that's my duty. It will almost certainly be tell the truth. Although he rejects, Kant famously said, not only do you have the duty to tell the truth in those situations, you have a duty to tell the truth even if a murderer comes to your door and asks for the location of a friend of yours. And you know that this person wants to kill your friend. You cannot lie to this person. Kant himself comes up with this example. Ross sides with Kant for the most part, in that he would say your duty to tell the truth is much more serious, and you have an intrinsic duty to tell the truth, not a duty to tell the truth only in those circumstances where it maximizes pleasure. You have a duty to tell the truth, but it can be trumped by other duties. Again, I'm using the term duty to refer to prima facie duties here. So it is a little bit confusing. But here's the best way that I can think of to explain the notion of prima facie duties. Think of them as like laws of physics. So laws of physics apply to us in all situations. For example, the law of gravity is applying to me. Now, the law of gravity explains that I will accelerate at a certain rate. But I am not accelerating right now. I'm certainly not accelerating downwards, which is what the law of gravity says I should do. So does that mean the law of gravity doesn't apply to me? No, it does apply to me, except something else applies to me as well, which is the solidity of, thank goodness, of the floor on which I'm standing. So my actual behavior cannot be predicted from any single law of nature that applies to me. My actual circumstances are a messy combination of all kinds of laws, all of them applying. But all of them are perfect laws. So they are laws that genuinely apply to me. So think of the prima facie duties as like laws of nature or laws of physics. Does any individual one of them by itself explain my behavior in any circumstance? No. Does that mean that it doesn't apply to me? No, again, it does apply to me. It's just there's a sort of combination of them. So my actual duty in any situation is related to all of the prima facie duties that are relevant to me in that circumstance. But no individual one of them can I just say, oh, here's my duty, that's all I need to look at, and that'll tell me what I have to do here. That's the problem with Kant. Kant seems to imply that in any circumstance, there'll just be one duty that will apply to you. No, we're sort of like a physical object bombarded by all of these forces at once, and we have to work out what the right thing is to do. So the prima facie duties is misleading. That's a minor self-criticism. I mean, he came up with a name, so he's kind of brought them upon himself. He just says that other possible labels have a problem, like he considers claim. So you might say my prima facie duties are in any circumstances, several different claims might be, several different people might have different claims upon me and they're pulling me in different directions. But he says, no, that's inexact for two reasons. One, it's sort of taking the viewpoint of the other person. It's talking about them having a claim on me, whereas I want to take the viewpoint of the person making the moral decision. And secondly, there may be circumstances where there isn't another person involved, as, for example, you have a duty of self-improvement. You don't say that you have a claim on yourself. That would be silly. So that's why he doesn't like the term claim, which other people use for a similar phenomenon. So that's his basic idea. Now, what attitude to common sense should we have? Both Kant and utilitarianism says that common sense is not the final guide to what is right. The final guide to what is right is the theory. And if there's a clash between common sense and the theory is correct. Whereas Ross is an intuitionist. That is, he says that we have a kind of moral sense. Now, this is not an empiricist moral sense that there's this morality out there and we have like a sixth sense that detects it. It's more like a capacity like logical reasoning or mathematical reasoning. So he says, he uses the phrase self-evident. Certain moral truths are self-evident to us in the same way that mathematical truths and logical reasoning is self-evident. He says this on page 29. It is self-evident just as a mathematical axiom or the validity of a form of inference is evident. Now, intuitionism has come under a lot of fire because Well, for one thing, where do our intuitions come from? Skeptics would say that our intuitions are just the products of our environment and our culture. And if you're in a kind of toxic environment or a toxic culture, you will have intuitions that are genuinely bad. So intuitions are just, knee-jerk assumptions, you might say. And yet, here comes Ross and many philosophers who, before and since, who accord to our intuitions this kind of elevated status. And actually, an awful lot of philosophy does seem to do this, because what is the favorite tool of the philosopher? It's a thought experiment. Most of the most famous elements of philosophy papers will be famous thought experiments. Mary in the Black and White Room, Thompson's Violinist, all these kind of things, which the philosopher Daniel Dennett rather scornfully calls intuition pumps. That is, they're supposed to stimulate you to stimulate your intuitions to agree with the philosopher that's using them. Now, Ross thinks that intuitions are, when theory clashes with intuitions, the intuitions should win out. Why? Why should we give this status? Well, first of all, he doesn't. You could say at one point, well, different people have different intuitions. So what are we going to do there? Do we say this person's got the right intuitions and this person's defective? How do you work it out? And he says, well, basically, the raw data of our moral reasoning should be the moral convictions of the best people. Now, this, of course, should make our hackles rise, because we would think, well, that sounds elitist. You're just saying that by the best people, you mean people like you. Now, he doesn't always use this kind of terminology. If you look on page 17, he talks about a plain man, a paragraph at the bottom. When a plain man fulfills a promise because he thinks he ought to do so, it seems clear that he does so with no thought of its total consequences. He's using this as an argument that utilitarianism has the wrong idea of what motivates us or what should motivate us, because utilitarians say the consequences are what are important. Whereas he's saying when people keep a promise, they're not caring about the future, the consequences that keeping a promise will bring about. They care about the past, the fact that they made a promise. So he doesn't always use this term best people, or another phrase that he uses on page 41 is right at the top, the moral convictions of thoughtful and well-educated people are the data of ethics. So you can make a comparison again with science in this respect. A scientific theory, because Ross is constructing a moral theory. Now, a scientific theory is considered good or bad to the extent that it explains the data. That's why Einstein replaced Newton, because Einstein said light will behave in a certain way that conflicted with what Newton said it would, and Einstein turned out to be right. So all of the data we had, Einstein's theory fits more of it than Newton's does. So the best theory, according to Ross, is one that fits the data. Now, what is the data? These guys would say it doesn't include what the average person thinks, because what do they know? Whereas Ross is saying, no, you've got to take account of the moral convictions of thoughtful and well-educated people, because they reveal something true about morality. Now, again, what do you do when people disagree? He says, well, and actually, it's easy to make his theory sound suspect, but it's also very clearly, he's describing something we genuinely do. Because how do vegetarians argue with meat eaters that they should be vegetarian? The answer is, and you can look at all kinds of examples of this, the answer is they point out that the meat eaters are being inconsistent, that the meat eaters are not being true to their own principles. So they're not just saying, oh, you're stupid, you just don't understand the truth, which is that vegetarianism is right. What they say is, look, you yourself are opposed to cruelty, right? You wouldn't set a cat on fire. You would say that was horrific. But in effect, that's what you're sanctioning in eating factory-farmed meat, because in effect, they're doing something just as cruel as setting a cat on fire. So what he says, the way that it works is, he's not saying that every intuition is on a par. He says, just as some of the, he says, the moral convictions of thoughtful and well-educated people are the data of ethics, just as the sense perceptions are the data of a natural science. That kind of puts him in the era that he's in. It's the early 20th century is very influenced by empiricism, and they say, we don't know directly about the real world, we just don't know about sense perceptions of the world. This is Russell's view. Just as some of the latter, the sense perceptions, have to be rejected as illusory, so have some of the former, the moral convictions of thoughtful and well-educated people. But as the latter are rejected only when they're in conflict with more accurate sense perceptions, the former are rejected only when they're in conflict with other convictions which stand better the test of reflection. So he's doing something actually Quine talks about later. Quine says we have this web of belief, that a general theory of the world that we have to make consistent. Now, there are different ways to make it consistent. We can give up one principle over here or another principle over here to make it fit. But certainly there will be the case that if we find that there's an inconsistency in our view of the world, something has to be fixed. And if on looking at our set of principles, we find inconsistency, what do? We don't just say, I guess ethics is just inconsistent. There's one rule over here for rich people, one rule over here for poor people. We say, no, we've got to make it consistent. This is a very important conviction that we have, that ethics has to be consistent. So when the vegetarian is arguing with the meat eater, they're saying, you're inconsistent. So tell me, do you really believe that cruelty is wrong? Because if you do, you're going to have to give up the idea that it's okay to eat factory-farmed meat. Or are you, or are you going to bite the bullet and say, no, it's okay to eat factory-farmed meat, so therefore it's okay to set fire to cats? And clearly, one path is much more defensible than another. And the philosopher Nelson Goodman coined this phrase, reflective equilibrium, although the person who sort of really took it and ran with it is John Rawls, which is this idea that, if there's a clash between our data and our theory, we sort of try and make them come into an alignment. That doesn't mean always going with the theory or always going with the data. We sort of do it depending on the situation. Does that seem like a datum we could be wrong about? If in science, was that confirmed? Is that well confirmed by multiple experimenters, or is it just a one-off? If it's just a one-off, then that looks a bit fishy, so maybe we'll go with the theory. If it's a really well confirmed datum, then maybe we have to adjust the theory. Or maybe we just got to get it. So reflective equilibrium is we reach an equilibrium between our theory and our data, and it's sort of a give and take. That's kind of sounds like what he's suggesting. The existing body of moral convictions of the best people is the cumulative product of the moral reflection of many generations, which has developed an extremely delicate power of appreciation of moral distinctions. And this the theorist cannot afford to treat with anything other than the greatest respect. Sounds good. And, conservatives in general tend to push this line. that you should be a conservative because you're in going against our considered beliefs, you're going against the weight of history. But you know, if you're something like a Marxist, or if you have any kind of skeptical bent, you can say, wait a minute, that wasn't the considered convictions of history, that was the interests of the powerful and the products of propaganda of centuries. You know, in rebelling against the divine right of kings, we were doing the right thing. And the divine right of kings was just a fiction invented by the people in power who had the most means of propagating this lie. And, you know, we shouldn't have given it any weight at any point. It just came to be generally accepted because the people in power, it was in the interest of the people in power. So you can see why intuitionism is controversial. He does consider an interesting criticism on page 39, which doesn't get into, you know, propaganda as I've suggested, but he says, I've been talking about using what we think, or the moral convictions of the best people, as the data of ethics. But the criticism he considers is that what we think is influenced by theory. So Kant and the utilitarians are saying, look, Ross, you're telling me that when what my theory says clashes with the intuitions of the common man, or, you know, the best people or whatever, we should go with this because this is more likely to be true. But isn't it more likely to be the case that the intuitions that people have have been influenced by theories of the past? So intuitions are, instead of being what should determine theories, they're the byproducts of theories. Now he rejects this by saying Ross really loves talking about promises as sort of test cases, because he says, well, for one thing, promises are good instances of particular duties that depend on particular relationships. That's a thing that both of these theories tend to ignore. He says they're too general. Both of these theories are too general. That's his, in fact, if you want to isolate the core criticism that he attacks ideal utilitarianism, is that it ignores special relationships. Promises are duties I have that depend on a special relationship, depends on me having actually done something with a specific person. I don't have a duty to keep promises with everybody. I have a duty to keep promises with those and only those to whom I have made promises. So what he says, an awful lot of our behavior, of our moral duties, depends on special relationships. And this is a point that's been pressed by other people. So for example, utilitarianism and Kant don't seem to allow that we have special duties to our children. Like a hardcore utilitarian would say, you have just as much duty. The pleasure of a complete stranger is just as important to you as the pleasure of your children. And if you need to sacrifice your children to maximize the pleasure of others, you should do it. Whereas people who stress special relationships would say, no, because of the special relationship you have to certain people, say your children, there are very stringent moral duties you have to them that you do not have to other people. The special nature of relationships can give you special duties. Now, as utilitarians point out, that enables us, that can hurt humanity in general. I mean, if, for example, rich people decide that they need to buy their kids, you know, Maseratis for Christmas instead of giving the money to charity and saving people starving on the other side of the world, that just seems wrong. So this idea that, you know, we have overwhelming duties to our children to the expense of everybody else, that seems extreme. But that's the basic idea. Okay, yeah, let's talk more about these main criticisms of utilitarianism. So, he says it is simplistic. Let's quote him on page 19. He says, I'm looking at page 20. In fact, the theory of ideal utilitarianism seems to simplify unduly our relations to our fellows. It says, in effect, that the only morally significant relation in which my neighbors stand to me is that of being possible beneficiaries by my action. They do stand in this relation to me, and this relation is morally significant. So he agrees with that, yes, we do have, remember, one of the prima facie duties is a duty of beneficence, to make sure, to facilitate the happiness or the good of others. So yes, I do stand in the relationship of their pleasure being morally significant. But they may also stand to me in the relation of promisee to promisor, of creditor to debtor, of wife to husband, of child to parent, of friend to friend, and the like. And each of these relations is the foundation of a prima facie duty. So it's simplistic because it ignores special relationships. So you can see these two criticisms are related. What he says on page 22 is the essential defect of the ideal utilitarian theory is that it ignores, or at least does not do full justice to, the highly personal character of duty. If the only duty is to produce the maximum of good, as ideal utilitarians say, the question, what is to have the good, who is to have the good, whether it is myself or benefactor or a person to whom I have made a promise to confer a good on him, would make no difference. So this is a common criticism of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism doesn't judge who gets the good. It just sums the total amount of pleasure existing in a society. It doesn't assess the distribution. But of course, as Kant and deontologists point out, it's bad if bad people are getting the pleasure. If somebody who's a murderer, somebody who is a murderer, you don't have a duty to maximize their pleasure in the same way that you have a duty to somebody who is inventing a cure for cancer. Who gets the pleasure is important, and that's something that utilitarianism ignores. Pushing this further, he says, it goes against common sense. And this is just an example of an illustration. And of course, going against common sense is a prime flaw for an intuitionist, because common sense is our best judge of what is right. He considers examples of, if I have promised to confer on A particular benefit containing 1,000 units of good, is it self-evident that if by doing some different act I could produce 1,001 units of good for A himself, it would be right for me to do so? So the utilitarian says, do what maximizes pleasure, whereas the common sense says, no, you've got to discharge your promises first. And another example he gives is, I've got to pay off my debts before I can give to charity. When your debtor comes to you, your creditor, when the person you owe money to comes to you and says, where's my money? You can't say, oh, I had it, but I gave it to charity because that was better. That's okay, right? He would say, Ross would say, not only is that not legal, but that would be immoral because you have this special duty that you have to discharge first. And that's something that these can't acknowledge. Now, because you can't really weigh up the importance of, you can't sort of, using the same measurement unit, you can't say, well, keeping my promises is worth 5 units, whereas maximizing happiness of others is worth 4 units, so I can do a little sum and say I should keep my promise in this situation. You can't do that. It's each situation is these absolute laws in conflict, and how do you decide? You have to make some calculation of the right act, what is the right act in particular circumstances. And as he says, he doesn't use the phrase Messian and exact. He says it is how does he say? The sense of our particular duty in particular circumstances, preceded and informed by the fullest reflection we can bestow on the act in all its bearings, is highly fallible, but it is the only guide we have to do our duty. So we have a sense of duty that we have to sort of train to pick out the right action. And he mentions a little bit about when do we acquire this ability that I say that he's arguing for to recognize prima facie duties. And he says about the same time we develop similar faculties like math and logic. As our brain develops, we develop this, but we do. And presumably just as there are expert mathematicians, there would be expert moralists. And then the question would be, how do we recognize those? And we should recognize those. And just as we have a math department of great mathematicians, we should have an ethics department. He goes into, one more thing. He goes into a discussion of how right does not equate to optimific, as the utilitarian argues that it must. The utilitarian says optimific, that is optimizing, and right should coincide, whether deductively or inductively. And he says it ends up being neither. There's a long argument which concludes on page 39. I conclude that the attributes right and optimific are not identical, and that we do not know either by intuition or by deduction or by induction that they coincide in their application. Still latter, that optimizing is the foundation of right. Now, he says, if we're not under special obligations, then clearly we should do what maximizes happiness. But we've got to discharge our special obligations first. Okay, a couple more criticisms. It's unsystematic. He says, these guys can say, my system makes sense. You're just listing a jumble of duties, Why are there 5? Why aren't there 3? Why aren't there 2? Maybe there's only 1, like I say. Maybe you can reduce them to the others. Why are there 4 goods? You're just making stuff up. In response, he can say, well, I'm just looking at the world. Why? You might ask the similar question, why are there X number of elements in the periodic table? There just are. Look and you will see. There's no decision procedure, which of course is another feature of it being unsystematic. Whereas here, the advantages of this is that there's a simple decision procedure. And again, he would just have to say, well, too bad. That's just the way things are. Ethics is hard. And you can tell I'll give you a bunch of examples, and you can't come up with a theory. Your theory does not fit with our intuitions. Which should we go with? Our intuitions. Yes, and also in response to this, he says, but the problem with your decision procedure is it doesn't really, it only seems to make sense if you look at vague general cases. But if you look at actual instances of should I keep my promise, or should I, I'm on my way to a meeting and then an accident happens. Should I help the people there, or should I keep my promise to go to the meeting? Help me out here, Utilitarians would say, well, whatever maximizes happiness. But you can't tell in most situations. And, the trouble with Kant is, depending on how you describe your action, it seems like you could universalize it in one of 2 ways. So it doesn't seem like the alternatives have much of an advantage. This suggests, he considers, he's saying that my duty is on what is real. I have a real duty that I have to try and work out. But what a critic might say is, but morality has to be achievable. You can't say I have a duty that I might not know, shouldn't my duty be to do what I can know? Here he says, this is to conflate morally right versus morally good. And here, although he doesn't define it, morally good, he does say, is explainable in terms of praise or blame. So the right action isn't necessarily the one that I will be praised for. And the wrong action isn't necessarily the one that I will be blamed for. How we judge people morally good according to what we could rationally expect of them. You know, they did their best in a certain situation, and for that they should be praised. But that's not what's right. And this relates to the example, the extended example that he talks about towards the end of this chapter, where he says returning a book to a friend depends on an awful lot of circumstances beyond my control. And I can very sloppily just throw it in the post and miraculously it gets back. And if that happens, then I have done my duty, even though it didn't cost much. Or I can do everything in my power and it still fail, in which case I haven't done my duty. So again, the person who's done everything in his power is morally good, but hasn't necessarily done what is morally right, whereas the lazy person who got lucky can be morally right without being morally good. In the discussion of keeping promises, he says, I have a duty to keep my promise, whether or not it maximizes happiness. And he has, I think most people would agree that intuition is on his side. That our intuition is we have a duty to keep our promise, not to make people happy, but because we've promised them, because we have this special relationship. Now, the utilitarian can get more sophisticated and say, we can say that you have a duty to keep your promises in general, because we can give a utilitarian justification of the whole practice of giving promises. That this practice exists in society maximizes happiness. So therefore, you do have a duty to keep your promises because they're promises, but the whole system is explained in utilitarian terms. And this is sometimes called rule utilitarianism, although he doesn't use that term there. But he responds to that by saying, basically, again, this doesn't really fit with how people think they're being motivated. He says on page 38, to make a promise is not merely to adapt an ingenious device for promoting the general well-being. It is to put oneself in a new relation to one person in particular, a relation which creates a specifically new prima facie duty to him. So he just rejects that. And we've already looked at what we think is influenced by theory, which is a threat to his intuitionism. He would say, what he says in response to that is that we know, that we actually, I want to maintain that we actually know. This forms the standard by reference to which the truth of any moral theory has to be tested. I hope that I have in what precedes indicated what in my view these elements of knowledge are that are involved in our ordinary moral consciousness. That's where he goes on to talk about the thoughtful and well-educated people. There we go. All right. I think that'll do it for W.D. Ross.